Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Elspeth Van Buren. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bristol in the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies, but I'm also the coordinator or one of the co-coordinators of SPIN, the Secrecy, Power, and Ignorance Research Network, a multidisciplinary network spanning several institutions in the southwest of the United Kingdom and made up of scholars from all sorts of different disciplines and working at all levels of their studies, everything from undergraduate up to professor. And we've got a broad set of interests and expertise associated with secrecy and ignorance, all committed to understanding this power of unknowing. This evening, I'm delighted to welcome you to the next event in our series of events funded by the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. As over the coming 18 months, we have a series of lectures, panels, and workshops on the theme of secrecy and ignorance in order to support the development of this exciting line of research. And today in particular, we're really happy to welcome Professor William Walters to help launch his book, The State Secrecy and Security Refiguring the Covert Imaginary, now out with Routledge. This is in fact Professor William Walters' second visit to Bristol, even if this is just a virtual one, as almost 3 years ago, he was a Benjamin Meeker visiting professor with us while completing some of the work associated with the project. So it's really exciting to hear how it has evolved. Professor William Walters researches and teaches politics at Carleton University, Ottawa, where he is the Public Affairs Research Excellence Chair. He's the author of Unemployment and Government, Genealogies of the Social, and Governmentality, Critical Encounters. He is co-author of Governing Europe, Discourse, Governmentality, and European Integration, and co-editor of Global Governmentality and Via Politics, Borders, Migration, and the Power of Locomotion. Trained as a chemist at Imperial College London, before switching into politics and studying for an MA at CUNY and then a PhD at York University, Professor Walters has published widely, therefore, in the areas of citizenship studies, the political sociology of states, and international government, the geopolitics of borders and migration, and now most recently, power and secrecy. So in this latest book, Professor Walters calls for secrecy to be given a more central place in critical security studies and elevated to become a core concept when theorizing power in liberal democracies. So state secrecy and security offers readers a set of thinking tools to better understand the strange powers that hiding, revealing, lying, confessing, professing ignorance, and many other operations of secrecy put in motion. So we're therefore really excited to welcome him and to celebrate this new contribution to the conversation. But alongside William tonight, we're joined by a number of key thinkers when it comes to secrecy and ignorance, to think about the book in relation to secrecy studies and security studies. So we welcome 4 discussants. We've got Professor Marieke de Goot from the University of Amsterdam, Professor Brian Rappert from the University of Exeter, Professor Lindsay McGooey from the University of Essex, and Dr. Oliver Kearns from SPIN Research, or a SPIN Research Fellow at the University of Bristol. So following William's opening remarks, each of our panelists will have a chance to offer their thoughts on the core claims of the book and its contributions. And then we'll open up the discussion to the panel in general and take your questions and engage in a bit of a bigger conversation. So during the conversation, during the presentations and discussions, please feel free to drop comments and questions into the chat box, which we'll be keeping an eye on. And please note that the session is being recorded because we'll be looking to circulate a video of it later. Okay, so without any further ado then, I'm going to turn the screen over to William to properly introduce his book. William.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. I want to start by, well, I'm going to mostly read because I know no other way to sort of get in under 15 minutes. But I want to start by thanking Elspeth and Claire Stevens and other SPIN people convening this event in the course of writing the book. Elspeth has been a brilliant interlocutor to whom I'm grateful. And I also want to say what a privilege it is to share a panel, or more accurately, some little squares with 4 people whose work on ignorance and secrecy has been an inspiration, and to whom I am indebted for helping me puzzle over this topic. And thanks to all of you who've logged on. I know in the multi-channel Zoomiverse, we're sport for choice. Lots of events going on at the same time, so it's great to have you here today. Andy Warhol never said that we all have 15 minutes of Zoom. but that's what I've got here, and I'll use those precious minutes to speak to three questions. First, why did I write this book? Second, what do I consider its key contribution? And third, what does it leave hanging? What does it fail to resolve? So firstly, why did I write the book? And I want to try to answer this with a secrecy vignette, to borrow a useful term that Marika has recently coined. And as Elspeth mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in chemistry. I only took up political science when I went to CUNY in New York to do a master's. I was interested in international politics, especially the freedom struggles in the Middle East, but I was very naive, and I didn't realize that studying politics and doing political science, especially American political science, are not always the same thing. So I enrolled in a course in international relations theory, and we read Kenneth Waltz From Snout to Tail. And it was 1987, and the inquiry into Iran-Contra was in full flow. And I was fascinated with the story of how Oliver North, one of the key protagonists and figures in the scandal, had shredded masses of classified documents, no doubt to cultivate ignorance surrounding the work of his clandestine project. So I wrote my first paper for the course on Ollie North and the Shredder. And my argument went something like, how are we supposed to do scientific foreign policy analysis when documents get hidden, shredded, faked, and so on. And I got a D for the paper, which is one of my lowest ever grades as a student. And I'm sure it was a poor paper, since I had little idea of how to write for the social sciences. Nevertheless, I was taken to task by the professor for my choice of topic. We were supposed to critique IR theories, not delve into grubby scandals about shredders or secretaries who had helped to smuggle papers out of the old executive building in their boots. And the lesson I took from the little encounter was that secrecy and subterfuge were not a topic for high IR. At most, they were perhaps the subject matter for intelligence historians or movies by that other notable Oliver Stone. So I felt that the topic was not respectable, it was inappropriate, not welcome at the polished dinner table of IR. Sovereignty and security, yes, but secrecy, not really. Or only if it could be rendered into a positivist analysis of deception and strategic action. Now, I'm glad to say that much has changed in the intellectual landscape of IR and political science in the meantime, opening more room for the secret. There was no critical security studies to speak of in the late 1980s and no cultural turn. So I'm glad that secrecy has become more acceptable and popular as a topic, and that's something I've sought to contribute to with the book. Even so, I think there are many areas of critical studies where secrecy remains something of a blank spot, and that's something I flag in the book. For example, it's definitely the case that with important and influential work on material publics, inspired by actor network theory, the ideas of Law, Calon, Latour, Mares, and others have made quite an impact on critical security research, but they haven't proved very interested in secrecy. So while this kind of research follows actors and talks about how objects and subjects are brought into the hybrid forum, how public concerns are constructed, it says very little about the work of silencing actors, intimidating them, or even making certain things and people disappear through various means, some of them quite gruesome. So I felt that this otherwise excellent work had a blind spot about secrecy and was somehow too ironic for that reason. And that's something that also motivated me in writing the book. So what do I consider the key contribution of the book? I think that one of its more useful contributions is to further debates that ask, how is secrecy constructed? How is it carried on? I tried to answer this on two levels. First, at the level of the imaginary. I actually think critical security researchers have not paid sufficient attention to what one might call the discursive or symbolic construction of secrecy. Compare that to studies of security, obviously, the whole idea of securitization, constructing things as security issues. Compare it with studies of the nation. No end of reflection on how national communities are imagined and enacted through school curricula, songs, or banal practices like the weather report. So where would we look, though, if we're interested in the social imaginary of secrecy? Well, information campaigns and government propaganda offer a nice illustration of this symbolic construction of secrecy, as yet another Oliver, this time Oliver Kearns, who's with us here, has shown in his work on eavesdropping. So think of all those wartime posters which urge the citizen, the worker, the housewife, these figures to keep quiet because you never know who's listening in. Don't gossip, loose lips sink ships. These are particular concretizations of what I call in the book the covert imaginary. They're also mythologies in Roland Barthes' sense. They conjure a particular image of surveillance and secret keeping and do it in a very anthropocentric way. They portray secrets as information and gossip passed between people who are usually co-present in a room. But in the 1940s, when these posters were widespread, a great deal of information was being accumulated by states, not by physical eavesdroppers in pubs and cafes, not by spies in the classical sense, but through signals intelligence, Bletchley Park and all that. But that infra-secrecy, as I call it in the book, appears nowhere in the covert imaginary of the time for obvious reasons. Whereas today, signals intelligence is very much a part of our covert imaginaries. Snowden and all that. But this covert imaginary is generated in other contexts as well, not just by official programs. And in the book, I look at how artists, journalists, and everyday visitors to former security sites, in my case, the ruined military testing site called Orford Ness, and here, I just want to say hello to David Warren, a former veteran of Orford Ness, who's online with us today, and he's just launched an online website for his research project called IRGON, I-R-G-O-N, if you want to Google that. So these, I looked at these different kinds of visitors and interpreters at Orford Ness and how they fashion particular landscapes of secrecy through their blogs, their art, their narratives. And I also look in the book at how anti-deportation activists mobilize a covert imaginary from below in a sort of adversarial way by playing upon sinister ideas of sinister figures like the secret plane, the ghost flight, in order to scandalize deportation and the deportation practices of the state. So all of this is that the covert imaginary is multi-sided and heterogeneous in its production, its circulation, and its effects. But the book also examines the construction of secrecy at a second level, albeit one that's related. It's that of socio-material practices, and indeed whole infrastructures dedicated to the production and management of secrets. I'm just going to close the window a minute because the garbage truck is here, the bins. So, for example, I look at cryptanalysis, since that provides us with a very concrete material way in which concealment and disclosure is attempted on an industrial scale by the middle of the 20th century. So these are technologies of secrecy that deserve to be given more attention, I think, by critical scholars. Looking at cryptanalysis and cryptology enabled me to make another argument in the book, which was about the need to mobilize our conceptions of secrets and secrecy. So what I find fascinating about cryptanalysis, about coding and decoding, and about signals intelligence is that it somewhat confounds our image of the secret as something locked away, enclosed, stored in a box or room. Instead, it confronts us with questions of mobility and flow. It allows us to investigate some of the containers, the practices, the networks, the personnel, the material transformations and translations that allow information to pass securely and secretly through otherwise open systems of communication, postal systems, telegraph cables, airwaves, fiber optics. And it allows us to think better about the limits of those infrastructures, where and how they leak information, what friction they generate, the questions of jurisdiction that they encounter, and how they sometimes fail. So the material and discursive construction of The Secret. It's a question that I think is being tackled from a number of angles, whether through studies of the production and negotiation of ignorance, as Brian and Lindsay have done so well, whether through work on the aesthetics of The Secret, as in the artistic and scholarly practice of someone like Trevor Paglen or the cultural studies of Claire Birchall, or from the angle of the sociology of controversies, as Marika has shown. So I think my book has made a contribution to these lines of inquiry. So lastly, what does the book leave hanging? I think one should feel good and an element of sort of satisfaction at finishing a book, but also an element of dissatisfaction. You know, a question raised but not nailed, something that nags at you. And for me, there are several, but the one I'll mention here has to do with the need to decenter secrecy. So at the start of the book, I insist that I'm not interested or persuaded by the idea of a theory of secrecy and not comfortable about making general claims about something called secrecy. Nevertheless, there are places where I think I lapse into generalizations and end up speaking about secrecy as a thing. So how do we avoid reifying and essentializing secrecy? One answer, I think, offered by the sociology of ignorance is to deprivilege the category of secrecy, not to dispense with it, certainly, but to keep it in its place. A different approach, possibly complementary, and one I'd like to try in future work, is to think about secrecy along lines loosely suggested by Wittgenstein's language games. And one could call this secrecy games. You know, for Wittgenstein, it's impossible to give a single or universal definition of game. Instead, we should reflect on all the different activities that can be called a game and think in terms of their family resemblances. So a focus on secrecy games would include the study of controversies, the game of scandal, if you like, wherein certain knowledges, practices, or actions come to be labeled by certain actors as secret, but perhaps not by others, or secret for this reason here, but secret for a different reason over there, or in a different way. And I hint at such an approach in my chapter on the 9/11 Commission. So maybe that would be one way also to think about decentering secrecy. So I've offered a few remarks about my motivations in writing the book, a few of its accomplishments, as I see them at least one area of weakness. And with that, I'll wrap up, and I look forward to the comments of my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, William. And I think we can offer you a virtual round of applause as we would do in a theater, I think, just for those opening remarks. Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn over to our discussants now. And we'll begin with Professor Marieke de Goede from the University of Amsterdam. So Professor Marieke de Goede is a professor of politics with a focus on Europe in a global order at the Department of Politics at the University of Amsterdam, where she co-directs the research group Transnational Configuration, Conflict and Governance, and holds a grant from the European Research Council with the theme Following the Money from Transaction to Trial. And you can find out more about that project at www.projectfollow.org, which includes consideration of the secrecy element of these processes. Professor de Gode's research therefore focuses on counterterrorism and security practices in Europe, with a specific attention to the role of financial data, part of which involves recently co-editing with Esme Bosma and Polly Pallister-Wilkins and publishing this book on methods for studying secrecy in security research. And this is also published with Routledge. She received her PhD from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne before working in the New School in New York and then being appointed to the University of Amsterdam. She's also author of Speculative Security and co-editor with Louisa Moore of Risk and the War on Terror. Welcome and thank you, Marieke.
Thank you so much, Elspeth, for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be on this panel. I'm delighted to engage in conversation about this book with William and with the others on this panel. And thank you very much to you, Elspeth, and to the SPIN Network for organizing it and hosting us. I really enjoyed reading this book, William. It was such a pleasure to recognize year-long conversations that we've had over time when we've seen each other at events or ran into each other at various events and conferences. And I recognized various arguments that from your other written work, but also from conversations we've had. I just looked up when we once had a conference at the Watersnood Ramp Museum, which is a museum in the Netherlands that commemorates the floods of 1950 in the Netherlands, and it is in a bunker, but it is a museum. So this museum in a bunker where we had our workshop, where you presented an early version, I think, of the chapter on the 9/11 inquiry, but it was also such a great place, such a great mix of secretive bunker with its own war history and publicness, because the museum is housed there. And so that was, I think, one of the first moments when we had a conversation and a dialogue about your research on secrecy and the role of secrecy in security studies. It was in 2015, I just looked it up, so it's a few years ago. And you are kind enough to refer to some of the work that I've done with colleagues throughout the book, but I see that very much also as a result of conversations that we've had over the years that I found very inspiring and that sort of helped me carve out certain questions and research focus. What I think is very important, so you just gave us a summary of the book. One of the things that I think is super important about the book and that's articulated so well is the notion of secrecy as productive. And so we tend to think about secrecy, and this is changing now with the emerging literature. But for a long time, we tend to think about secrecy as something that's an obstacle, as something that's forbidding or prohibiting, that's stopping us from the research. But you very clearly show that secrecy is more than concealment. It's a set, and I quote, of organizing and structuring principles, end of quote. It gives shapes to public controversy. It gives shape very clearly to the work practices of ourselves as researchers. And this is also what we try to do in the Secrecy and Methods book that Elspeth was kind enough to mention, is not just to encourage researchers not to focus purely on the question, how did you overcome secrecy, but rather to focus more on the question, how has secrecy or obfuscation or dynamics of disclosure shaped your work? How may it have affected your findings? And what does it tell you about those actors that are engaging in practices of secrecy and obfuscation? And I think you make this case very eloquently throughout the book. You also make a very strong case. It's almost, like an agenda setting case that security studies researchers should be paying much more attention to secrecy and what it does and how it operates and how it structures findings than we have done so far. And even for people who are not convinced by that agenda, you offer a treasure trove of concepts and ideas that we can draw on. Disclosure devices, you talk a lot about the material publics of inquiry. There's really interesting readings of the work of conspiracy theories and the role of place in Orfordness in structuring secrecy and thinking about those histories. So very strongly recommended. Before I use up all my time with praise, let me ask you a couple of questions or a couple of things that came to my mind that I wanted to push you on and perhaps ask you to explain a bit more. One of them, the first of them, is about the gendered nature of the covert imaginary. So you do a really good job of setting out the covert imaginary, how we have thought about secrecy, the assumptions, the effective structures of secrecy's image. But it's always struck me that the covert imaginary is very gendered. Even, there's this kind of heroic, singular, individual romantic masculinity, I think, accorded to the covert imaginary. Even someone like Edward Snowden, who, has obviously done a lot for the debate on surveillance and security practices, but even his figure, and let's not even talk about Julian Assange, you know, but even Snowden's figure, I think, is particularly masculine and heroic. And if you contrast that, for example, with the role and the image of Natalie Sowers-Edwards, who is the woman who leaked the so-called FinCEN files, she has hardly had the same recognition, public visibility, and public applause as Snowden did. Of course, the FinCEN files are a very different type of leak from the materials that Snowden leaked, but still, I think the process of recognition of this heroic whistleblower does have a gender dynamic, and it's not something you talk about when you talk about the covert imaginary. So I wanted to push you a little bit on that. My other question is about your methodology of the probe, which I really like. And I like that you don't talk about case studies, which I think is a very problematic term, but you also choose not to talk about controversy studies or controversy mapping, which is more of a, you know, a term that's often used in STS-inspired research. You talk about the probe, and the probe is both an object that can be inserted into something to be studied. It has a sense of a you know, a thorough, penetrating investigation. There's something very material, I think, to the connotation of the probe. But I think my main question about the probe is what does it mean to do a probe? Like, how could others use it as a method? As a methodological approach. Like, how would you advise others, perhaps, who are not even looking at secrecy, who are perhaps looking at completely different topics, but would the probe be a methodology that can be used and reused by others, and how might they go about it? And then my final question would be about the chapter on the 9/11 inquiry, the 9/11 committee's inquiry. I think it's a great chapter. It's very rich in conceptualization. It's the chapter perhaps where you talk most about the relationship to the material publics literature, and how public how publics come to be, how they are brought into being, but also, you know, the material elements and requirements for an inquiry and for publicness to take place. You also show that the inquiry can be a really important place for well, it can be an important site of making things public. I thought especially the example of how it's one of the first places where we learn about drone warfare and aerial targeted killing. I did not know. I thought that was very, very interesting. But I wanted to ask about the literary style of the 9/11 committee report, which you do mention. So you mention on page 89 how the 9/11 committee chose this very textual and literary style. They did so deliberately because they wanted a public to be able to read it and to be drawn to it. But that also relates to, you know, larger questions around writing secrecy. So how can we write with secrecy, which is of course also the work that Brian Rappert has done, which I, you know, much admire and very inspired by. I wanted to ask you, William, what that means, what you think that meant for the 9/11 committee report, that they choose this textual style. What kind of secrecy effects did it have, or publicity effects, if you like? How did it affect the way that this report perhaps was seen and read, and how it was able to act as a device of closure or disclosure? So I'll leave it there. I look very much forward to the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those opening comments, Marieke, for the discussion. Next, I'm going to turn to Professor Lindsay McGoey. Professor Lindsay McGoey is Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, with expertise in social theory and economic sociology. She is recognized internationally for playing a pioneering role in the establishment of ignorance studies, also known as agnotology, an interdisciplinary field focused on exploring how strategic ignorance and the will to ignore have underpinned, in this case, economic exchange and political domination throughout history. Her research on ignorance has led to new conceptual frameworks for understanding the political value of ignorance and the unknown. So, for example, this work has included her book, No Such Thing as a Free Gift, The Gates Foundation and the Price of Philanthropy, the first book-length analysis of the Gates Foundation's influence on global health and development, and The Unknowers, on the important work of strategic ignorance in all sorts of different settings. She's also the founding editor with Matthias Gross and Michael Smithson of the Routledge Research in Ignorance Studies book series. So we're really delighted to welcome her here tonight because she really is a leading expert on ignorance. Welcome, Lindsay. Oh, you're muted, Lindsay. I don't know if you started.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Thanks so much, Elspeth. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks so much to the organizers for putting this event together and for the invitation to have a chance to discuss William's excellent book. It's a pleasure to have a chance to comment on this fascinating book by William Walters. One of the compelling aspects of it is its empirical breadth and the different cases or probes engaged with. Just trying to get my screen to do something slightly different. Sorry about that. And like William, I find it hard sometimes to say things engagingly and of much breadth and depth if I'm not reading them, especially in a very short time frame. So I have a few comments which I'll read out in the allocated time. So as has already been noted, a compelling aspect is the empirical breadth of the book, which really looks in an innovative way at different case studies from the response to 9/11 to the politics of deportation. Another compelling aspect is the conceptual and the theoretical contributions that the book makes, particularly to the development of what I would say is really a new ontological way of thinking of secrecy. And on the one hand, his goal is to insist upon the mutability, as he puts it, of secrecy, or how it is accomplished in distinctive ways in different time periods and regions and empirical areas. And in this way, his work resonates with, for example, the work of Daston and Galison on the history of objectivity. But also to examine the mutability of secrecy requires a sort of baseline ontology of the original subject. Even if that is a plural and a shifting baseline, it's still necessary, I think, when looking at the mutability of something, to consider what something is mutating away from or towards, to consider what is, quite paradoxically, universal about a shifting and a changeable imaginary. And to my mind, that's the most interesting aspect of Walter's book, which is the fact that he compels us to think differently about what the ontology of secrecy is. And the way he treats secrecy also leads to new ways of thinking about different aspects of liberal modernity, and particularly to the curious way that people often seem to be more tolerant of hierarchies of power as long as they are obvious hierarchies rather than less obvious or veiled ones. And that might seem like an obvious point in ways, the fact that people tend to be more suspicious of what they can't see than what they can see. But I also think it's a problem for theorists in a way that's not attended to enough. So in short, I think it leads to an important question, which is to ask, why aren't people equally concerned about the unknowns that they are aware of and that they can see? And to make what I mean clearer, I want to discuss a point of Walter's that I found compelling and insightful, but also relatively, perhaps a little bit comparatively underdeveloped when it comes to examining the implications of the insight. And that insight is his recognition of a strange paradox, which is that, as he puts it, given that secrecy is, and I'm going to quote from him here, fundamental to the very constitution of the liberal democratic state, we might assume that the analysis of secrecy would feature prominently in the project of critical security studies, end of quote. And so it's a curious lacuna, it's a curious dearth of attention, and his book in many ways redresses that dearth. And he also notes that this dearth of attention has changed somewhat in recent years, which he covers in a very eloquent way. But I'm still left wondering about why there was the lacuna to begin with. In short, what are the conceptual implications of the fact that secrecy has traditionally been rather sidelined as a core aspect of both critical security studies and political theory more broadly? So I wondered why the lacuna to begin with. And my own provisional response to this question, which was that, thinking about it as a sort of thought experiment, it's ignored in political and social theory because secrecy points to larger realities about social hierarchies that also tend to be sidelined. And so the dearth of attention to secrecy runs parallel to the dearth of attention to hierarchy. You have reams of theories about inequality, for example, or about political authority and domination, but hierarchy as a sort of core conceptual node is not necessarily given the same touchstone status as a core node of analysis, particularly in purportedly egalitarian liberal democracies. And even in some of the examples that I think Walter cites in a nice way in the book, secrecy is acknowledged to create hierarchies of power and hierarchies of accessibility and visibility. But the questions of what that means for understanding power in liberal societies is not necessarily always apparent, which is hardly the fault of this excellent book, but which I think points to wider lacunas around the theorization of hierarchy today. So to me, what I took to be one of the most interesting aspects of the book is that it got me thinking about secrecy, hierarchy, and domination in new ways. And it led me to think about how some of the most exploitative modern hierarchies are rationalized and legitimated by the fact that there is no secret surrounding their manifestation and their existence. And therefore, people are less inclined to suspect that something conspiratorial or unsavory is going on around them. And one example is the manifestation of clearly growing income differentials and growing wealth concentration, which clearly people don't like and increasingly are starting to dislike more and more, but which, especially over the last 50 years, were largely accepted as being more palatable than they might have been if stats about wealth concentration were not readily available. And another example examined in the book is the case of the British and American government's use of torture, where toleration of that fact seems to have grown rather than declined in line with more knowledge about the practice. There was an outcry around torture in the immediate years post 9/11 in ways that seems to have paradoxically somewhat diminished today, a point that's suggested by some of Lisa Stampnitzky's work on torture and revelation, which Walter cites and builds upon nicely. And it's still notable that people seem to mind torture more the less they knew about it, and to accept it more the more they had their suspicions confirmed. Once it was admitted that there were secretive torture programs in place, the public largely acquiesced or grew comparatively indifferent to the claimed inevitability of the need for it. So to get back to my opening points about ontology, I think that Walter's book suggests, therefore, in a really interesting way, that one of the ontological curiosities of secrets is that to function as a secret, they need not be hidden. And in fact, they cease to be secrets if they're completely hidden and thus unknown. To be secrets, they must be openly inaccessible. So I thought of a thought experiment where you could point to a wall and say to strangers, there's a locked door on that wall. When the locked door is clearly visible, people would probably shrug. But if the wall is smooth without any clear apertures or markings to indicate where the locked door is, people might be more curious, more suspicious. They would want to find the missing locked door. What's behind the door in both cases is the same, something that's unknown and can be ignored. But the visibility of the locked door, the openness of the secret, is less disconcerting to people than secrets that they can't see or even imagine. In other words, the more obviously secret a secret is, the less productive it is of fantasy and denial or resistance, and the more productive it is of assent and compliance. And I think that there are interesting parallels here, more implied than I think completely developed in the book, but really fruitful parallels to people's comparative acceptance of hierarchy as long as they know about it, including hierarchies of income distribution. So to conclude, I think that Walter's book is productive of new insights into the social toleration of open hierarchies. I think that the book implies in a compelling way that one of the functions of secrecy is to make palatable different types of clear sources of domination that don't necessarily warrant the acceptance that they achieve, but which accomplish this spurious achievement through the publicity of the exploitation. And he concludes the book by suggesting that further research could examine the relationship between secrecy and different types of political change. And perhaps one thing I would push him to expand upon or to think about in the discussion, if there's time, is to talk a little bit more about that point. We could relate that to maybe what he said about games earlier, although maybe in the discussion we could talk a bit about games, because a key figure in ignorance studies has sadly died this week, Charles Mills. And one of the points Mills makes in his criticism of Rawls's work is that how dare Rawls talk about metaphors of games for people at the brunt or edge of the violence of liberal societies. Such a metaphor is too spurious even to be engaged with. I think that's a debatable point, but perhaps that's a good way of bringing in Walter's great points about Wittgenstein in games at the end of his talk, but then to relate that back to his concrete call for relating secrecy to different types of political mobilization and challenge to various exploitative hierarchies. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for those excellent comments. I'm really looking forward to hearing how the panel and how William and the panel and the audience engage with those. Those are really thought-provoking. So we're next going to turn to Professor Brian Rappert. Professor Rappert is Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Affairs at the University of Exeter. His research spans investigating the social and ethical dilemmas associated with scientific and technical expertise, the conduct of war, and the sociology of magic. And as his work often takes place in security and diplomatic communities, it explores questions of disclosure and concealment, including on the methodological issues associated with investigating and writing about these things, writing about secrecy, including theorizing silences and absences, how some issues are not considered, how some concerns go unsaid, what grievances never get formed, what paths in social and political life are never pursued. He has published a number of books, including How to Look Good in War, and a number of articles that center this relationship between knowledge, absence, silence, revelation, and secrecy, and often works very hard at trying to avoid reproducing and reifying the secret in the way that William, I think, was talking about. He is also a founding member of SPIN. So I'll turn over to Brian now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that generous introduction, Elspeth, and thank you for William for this opportunity to comment, and everyone here for participating. Yeah, I'm just going to start by echoing some of the kind of lovely compliments people have already made of the book. Yeah, I mean, it's a great systematic survey of existing literature in the area of, let's say, security studies. The cases are detailed. They are very well linked to theory. There are a range of cases: historical, contemporary, autobiographical, artistic. Yeah, I mean, and there's so many concepts that are interesting that have already been mentioned: the covert imaginary, the devices of disclosure. So yeah, I would suggest, you know, I guess people who are here, right? I mean, we're kind of students of secrets, right? And yeah, this is definitely a helpful resource in thinking through some of the issues that we have to contend with. Okay, so after these flowery comments, let me then say, okay, maybe get into some more kind of critical comments. But I suppose I want to do this in the spirit of thinking that I think, you know, Williams captured a lot of kind of existing currents within security studies, and I really want to kind of pose some questions as this book as a kind of representative of that field, and I suppose the kind of conditions under which secrecy study takes place, and maybe just pose some questions about how some of our kind of, you know, whatever base kind of assumptions and we can bring to the study of secrets. So one area where Williams already mentioned this, and it's come up in different ways, is in the idea of reification. And, you know, I think it's really interesting within the book. So as I think, you know, Lindsay mentioned, right? I can, you know, have a little quote here, right? Williams says, the secret isn't a self-standing object, but rather it's a correlate and the effect of a whole range of practical activities and social relations. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about secrets. But too, you know, as William kind of mentioned himself, the book kind of slides, I think, as many of us can at times, into a lane which maybe doesn't match that kind of sentiment. So some of the book anyway, the argument is cast in terms of following the secret. And Lindsay already mentioned some of the issues of ontology and how we think about secrets. I mean, I think, there have been fields which have really kind of struggled with this idea of how to think about characterizing an object that's moving all the time. So actor network theory would be one area where you might look at something like a knowledge claim, and then how you're going to talk about that, right? And it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle to be able to be able to capture that kind of mutation in a way which maybe does justice to what we want to say. Data studies as well. A colleague at Exeter where I work, Sabina Leonelli, interested in thinking about data, thinking about a defining characteristic of data as that it can circulate and that it mutates. Okay, again, like how are you going to do that? I think this is an area where I think security studies struggles, but lots of fields struggle, and so maybe we can have a little conversation about what we can learn from each other. Two at times on the issue of reification. So I kind of didn't like the language of probe. Okay, so I was a bit thrown when that came up, because I suppose there was a concept of, if you like, a kind of object for looking. And probe to me has this kind of connotation of something kind of stable. Maybe that's just the hangups I was getting in terms of what I brought to the concept. But yeah, probe, the kinds of language of angles that the book used from time to time. Yeah, I guess together these points I've raised so far, I mean, they raise a question about how do we, on the one hand, kind of both suspend a sense of the kind of object we're looking at, okay, and the objects by which we're looking. This just strikes me as a very difficult thing. So maybe we can have a conversation about it. Onto a different matter then. William talks about the temptations of kind of looking at everything as a secret. And in my own estimation, I thought maybe the book suffered from that from time to time. So there is discussion of what William mentioned, Orford Ness, and former weapons testing site in England. And here, I'm certainly convinced that one could understand it through secrecy. I suppose I felt the book used that as kind of dominant framing for understanding the site and understanding people's experiences. And here I had some questions about whether that was how much that was justified, and whether or not this chapter kind of slid into that kind of projection effort. So I don't know if David wants to say anything about all these things, but that would be one area where I think I would I suppose have some critical claims to make about the empirical grounding of the argument. But maybe to offer some more kind of generalized points, I was interested in some of the assumptions about the covert imaginary. And one of the things that William says about the covert imaginary, one of the ways in which he characterizes it, is he talks about the way in which, under this kind of thinking, there's an assumption that publicity is the opposite of secrecy, and then more transparency means less secrecy. Okay. So I definitely think that kind of way of thinking is prevalent in public conversations. But I also think it's important to note that in many ways it's not. Okay, so okay, we can go to a television program like Yes Minister. I don't know if everyone's seen that, where you can think of very colorful ways in which people have explored the ways in which transparency can lead to secrecy, right? But even beyond those kinds of areas, I mean, there's all sorts of fields: public relations, intelligence, entertainment magic, accounting, right? Where professionals have known for a long time and have talked about it in this way, right? That, yeah, you don't want to have these kind of stark oppositions between, say, secrecy and transparency. So as academics, we can often trip ourselves up because we want to try to characterize the world, right? We sometimes, right, we're trying to kind of pin it down and talk about its shape and so on. And so we can kind of lapse into ways of maybe ways of speaking which don't do justice to what we want to talk about. I still think it's worth kind of asking the question about when do these kinds of characterizations that are discussed as part of the covert imaginary come up? I mean, it's clear that within kind of public conversations, there's all sorts of different ways of talking about the relationship between secrecy and transparency. And I guess like a lot of forms of discourse, right? What is said and how it's said is very situational. So maybe we can have a discussion. Maybe William wants to talk to why certain kinds of discussions get reduced to the terms that he identified as covert imaginary. And I suppose for me as an academic, that one of the things that line of argument makes me think about is sort of what am I putting secrecy in conversation with? And I think maybe this speaks to this point of kind of what next and where to kind of go with this analysis. I mean, the way I'm trying to think about doing that in my own work is trying to unpack the kind of notion of revelation a little bit more. I think that's something maybe at least in a lot of literature I read and in my own work is a kind of thing, as a kind of term to to grab on and to juxtapose. But maybe its meaning needs to be thought through a little bit more than has been done so far in a lot of academic conversations. So anyway, how do we think about secrecy by what do we put it in conversation with? And then just as a final point, maybe just to go back to, I think the point that William started off with, which is the shredder example, and the way in which there's often discussion about secrecy as a form of concealment and shutting down and so on, and has already been identified. This book does a good job at thinking about secrecy as productive. But still, I think in secrecy studies, right, I often interested in thinking about how things get restricted or sequestered and closed and so on. And there are fields of study like science and technology studies where people take a very kind of different starting point in thinking about knowledge, where the question is not so much how does anything ever get shut down, but how does anything ever circulate in the first place, right? So rather than thinking about something as public that needs to stop, or that actors impose limitations on, the question becomes, how can things move? How can knowledge claims move at all? How can they circulate in the first place? And again, maybe that's a different kind of way of thinking about the kinds of areas that we're interested in. And yeah, with that, I think I'll draw to a close. But thanks so much for everyone for listening. And William, very much looking forward to your comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. So last but not least, I'm going to turn us to Dr. Oliver Kearns. Oliver is a SPIN Fellow at the University of Bristol, currently completing the research associated with an ESRC New Investigators Grant that explores the links between secrecy, sound, and state making through, in one case, a focus on number stations. These are the shortwave radio transmissions that have existed for decades, used to send coded messages to spies abroad. So it's a really fascinating and under-examined practice and set of artifacts. So Oliver has published on the secrecy and absences associated with drone strikes, works exploring whispering and silence as security practices, and is currently completing a book on secrecy and intelligence. Oliver is also a founding member of SPIN. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you, Elspeth, and thanks to William and the rest of you and the audience for being here. Being the fourth person on the panel means that there's a danger of going over more general or abstract conclusions that others have already broached. So I'll try to do a couple of more specific things here. I will say, of course, that I think that there's a lot of value, William, in this book in terms of maybe methodological tools, I'll say. For instance, what struck me was that the usefulness for myself of thinking about devices of disclosure when you're talking about the 9/11 inquiry. It's a very neat way of describing what Susanna Cressman has got at, acts of concealment and disclosure. They're always being flip sides of one another. I also think that it relates somewhat to work I know you've done in the past on publics. I wondered when I was listening to Lindsay talking about her interest in public secrets and the extent to which there's a normative effect there. People are more likely to find them legitimized or to accept them, whether that necessitates talking about who we think a public is exactly there, how we think we get that kind of information. Maybe that also speaks to Brian's point about what we think a covert imaginary is and where we think we can locate it in the world and who exactly holds it. But like I say, I'll focus on two specific examples here that I thought were interesting and could be explored more in discussion in the book. Starting with something funny that happened to me is reading the book. I was reading it as a PDF. In the course of doing so, the file managed to delete itself at least twice, like something out of a Mission Impossible film. This message will self-destruct, etc. I assure you, I was able to read the book, though again, secrecy-wise, how would you ever know? But you just have to trust me on that one. I thought afterwards that the effect of the book having disappeared was in some ways the same as if it had been made a secret, though so far as I could tell, it was just an accident of my computer. Made me then think, well, why be interested in secrecy if it can have effects which one can find equivalents or parallels to in things that have nothing to do with secrecy? What do we think is particularly interesting about secrecy, therefore? And how do we know it when we see it, as it were? The deletion also speaks to the issue of degradation and decay. And your book, William, does talk about explicitly and more implicitly this idea of decay in secrecy over time. That's what I want to talk about here. So you start your book by using a quotation from Hellervey, where you talk about a police commissioner being able to look at his own personnel file. This is something no one else is allowed to do in this state. He alone enjoys this privilege. Neither the ministers nor even the president of the republic get to see their own dossiers, which are shelved and maintained in archives that no one is permitted to examine. Shelved and archived. Okay, so the impression from that and from your cases or your probes, as it were, is that secrecy is something that has to be made to endure. So for instance, you talk about an infra-secrecy, as you mentioned, involving devices, infrastructures, technical details, things that keep the secrecy going, if you like. Those things need in a political economy, which you talk about too in the book. You need to invest in your secrecy in order to keep it up. Otherwise, the secrecy might start to break down. It'll need, in your own words, patch-ups and cover-ups. So what happens when you stop maintaining, or if your maintenance of the secrecy is somewhat shoddy, inappropriate to the context, and so on? If the secrecy, if you like, is left to its own devices, its own infrastructures and details, well, it might start to degrade, to decay, like ruins, which people studying ruins have talked about how they signal their own cryptic past role in regimes which have long gone, which you can't quite understand. I thought that was an appropriate way to start here, since William talks in the first chapter of his book, his first probe, about efforts to decrypt and decode Soviet telegrams during the Cold War. William likens it to a kind of archaeology. These not quite yet decrypted messages were stored for some future unlocking, like fossils or items being left in a museum until they're eventually figured out. They're sifted through using technology which shapes what you end up finding within them. It's a slow and painstaking work of deciphering that's always provisional in its results. And this is part of, as I see it in the book, William's efforts to overcome a link between secrecy and the keeping of a secret, the idea that a secret in a fixed spot is what produces an instrumental secrecy that surrounds and secures it. Those two things go together. So to that end, William talks about an inevitable interference of secrecy, the buzz or static that comes with creating a carrier signal to send a message, a telegram, for instance, the human hand typing that comes with producing messages, which can inevitably produce errors due to your limited resources. Maybe you can only produce so many code books, as in the example he gives in that chapter. that the secrecy always has this noise as part of its secret making. I wondered reading that chapter whether the interference is not just an inevitable accompanying error, that's a trace which is sometimes picked up and sometimes not. William draws upon media archaeology here, and those guys would often be more inclined to say the noise there is part of the very medium of making something. Medium is the message and so forth. It is part of the signification itself. So the noise is not some accompanying extra. It just is the signal. And part of the production of secrecy within social life is deciding which parts of those noise you think are socially significant, they're signifiers, and which parts aren't. So when people create radio messages or have created the technology of sending radio messages, they learned very quickly they would have to put in elements of redundancy, because inevitably people won't quite pick up everything and they'll be confused about what exactly they're supposed to be listening to, which part is the static, which part is the message, which part is the sound of the signal and the frequency or the ink of the words. If that's so, then maybe beyond thinking about archaeology, we could think about, archaeology implies sifting through soil for broken pottery and crumbled building work. That is the secret keeping. Maybe it's more like particulate analysis. You're endlessly shifting through this endless soil and reading its chemical composition, deciding what you think isn't naturally there, what you think is interesting, what suggests a change in the atmosphere caused by human beings or not, what represents the remains of some historical activity. Regardless of whether you think archaeology or chemical analysis works best, I think they're quite complementary there. I wondered whether the sifting through secrecy over time, the reworking of the soil, as William puts it, degrades secrecy's remains. Does secrecy inevitably always decay? That brings me to the other example of decay in the second chapter, where William talks about the memories of people who worked at Orford Ness, the site that Brian just mentioned. The decay of memory there for him is where veterans of those sites return and they can't quite recall what it is that they're being asked to think about when being prompted by other researchers, not just William, but others, into what secrecy was like on those sites. William has a quote here to sum it up. "I seem to recall, but it was so long ago. I could be wrong, but maybe blah, blah, blah." And so researchers have to use memory jogs, for instance, visiting the site, trying to prompt people, maybe fostering camaraderie, getting people in the mood, and then memories are brought forth. And William conceptualizes what's happening here in this memory work as a kind of multiplication of secrecy's social life. But what it reveals is secrecy isn't one thing, one process being done by officialdom, the states that used to own this site, the military that used to secure its borders. It has a lived experience secrecy. It's fluctuating. It depends upon how different people feel in different moments in time about their lives and about what they did. Again, this made me wonder, going beyond what's explicitly written here, would we want to say, when these veterans can't quite remember what happened, would we say secrecy has therefore been maintained there? Has secrecy been secured simply because of their failing faculties? If it has decayed, why hasn't the secrecy itself dissipated in the process? What kind of secrecy life is this, since there's no policing of its boundaries exactly, so far as we can see? I don't think that's a methodological problem. I think it's a conceptual advancement that William's exploring this in detail and talking about the fallibility of this memory work. Secrecy is associated with the place of Orford Ness in the form of an atmosphere. William quotes one of the documents written by someone maintaining the site now. The feeling of mystery and secrecy is evidence here due to the silence of the site, broken only by bird calls and rattling corrugated iron. Well, there's no practice of secrecy being pinpointed there. There's no securing of a site anymore. It's simply an experience of place, of tuning into a certain feeling of what it's like to be there. So I'd end by saying, as an extension of William's work in this book, trying to untangle our association between secrecy and keeping secrets, could we also talk about secretiveness, of the creation of that feeling rather than secrecy? Or perhaps just of being secretive. When I or anyone else act evasively or officially, am I creating secrecy necessarily? Those kind of questions speak to why we should be interested in secrecy in the first place. That's what I find great about the book, and I'll leave it there.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Oliver, for that really strong set of questions to complete our panel. So I'm going to now turn over to Dr. Claire Stevens, another spinster, who is going to lead us through the discussion and the questions. Claire, are you happy to take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Some fascinating reflections and some quite incisive questions. So I think without further ado, if it's okay with William, I'd like to turn it over to him to maybe address as many of those comments as possible. And while he's doing so, if anybody in the virtual room in the audience would like to pose some further questions, we've got a couple of great ones already. Do keep coming, sending them in. But yes, over to you, William. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to the four commentators and colleagues. I'm extremely indebted to you for those insights and provocations, and you know, it's like wonderful and challenging when you encounter someone else's take on your book or your work. It speaking of angles, it makes you rethink what you thought you were doing, and it's a marvelous and productive experience. So I'm going to I've set my timer again, so I'm not going to talk for more than 10 minutes in case people in the audience want to join in. But so I'll respond to as many things, as many of the points as I can in that time, and forgive me if I cherry pick to some extent or consolidate some of those points into a single kind of answer. But I'll sort of go through them more or less in the order that I wrote them down. So there was a number of questions about the COVID imaginary that Marika put on the table. And I absolutely agree when she says that one needs a much more gendered understanding of it, which I didn't provide. And going back to the example of wartime posters, you can see the sort of gendered nature of the kind of messaging there about the need for silence, because frequently they will show a housewife or a girlfriend and the sort of as though they were conduits or sirens or people who are more likely to gossip, so there's be a sort of a heroic soldier and then a girlfriend, and the girlfriend is sort of highlighted as the more gossipy one. I think, and this sort of question of heroization is really interesting, and it's definitely the case that the sort of masculine male, masculine whistleblower kind of figure. I mean, another version of this comes out in the sort of histories and the early representations of code breaking. It's the heroic scientist, or it's a figure like Alan Turing, sort of genius kinds of figures. Again, very often sort of masculine figures, very sort of eccentric. And I think here it's interesting to see how, that there is a sort of counter movement to that within scholarship and now within the public domain. So you have, there's lots of TV shows and movies about female code breakers, because the vast majority of them were female. So there is a kind of recovery of that sort of initially hidden or overlooked labor and intellect that went into code breaking, or a book like Liz Mundy's Code Breakers, which kind of looks at some of the ground of the Venona project that I was looking at. So there is a sort of, and that itself is tied to the covert imaginary, because it's sort of about uncovering hidden figures. There's even a movie with the title Hidden Figures. So these films, these investigations, these inquiries are both sort of outside and inside the covert imaginary, I would suggest. And my second point that's come up across a number of the comments is this sort of question of probe. And what I can say to sort of at least clarify a little bit of my use of it, and I admit I've used it rather loosely, kind of partly because I don't want to call these case studies a lot of times. I'm just looking for other ways to sort of frame my orientation. But one, I picked up on the idea of probe, both from just a sort of, in an everyday sense, space probe, but also there's a small literature in design theory that talks about probes. And there they sort of really emphasize that probes are sort of interactive. So it's about, you know, designers put together some sort of object and give it to a particular community and see how they interact with the object. So I wanted to sort of capture some of that kind of interactivity with the idea of probe. And that comes up, for example, you know, in the last set of comments that Oliver was making about the veterans, you know, so we have David Warren online with us today, who conducted the interviews with the veterans that I was fortunate to be able to use. And clearly there's a sort of probing quality to that sort of activity. You know, he was kind of interacting with people, taking them to the site. So it's more than just a question of asking a bunch of questions of somebody. It's, you know, there's an atmosphere if you take them to the site. There is a sort of context, there is a sort of staging, if you like. So probe captures some of that. But I think another reason I like the idea of probe was because on my part, it's sort of, there was a sort of ethos of humility in the sense that I felt that I was confronting vast literatures, right? You know, just as a sort of space probe is going out into sort of the vastness of space and confronting planets and things, I felt that, you know, I wasn't working with some very small finite cache. I was sort of trespassing or entering into, you know, vast areas that are already richly documented. So something like the Venona project that I looked at, you know, huge amount of literature on it. But for me, the probe then was about approaching that existing literature from a different angle, because I found that, you know, a lot of the people who had written sort of historical work on Venona were really interested in different questions. They weren't interested in the practices of secrecy, technologies of secrecy. A lot of them were fighting the Cold War. Or other sorts of things. So a probe for me was, you know, it was a question of angle. And I know that made Brian feel uneasy, because I can see that the probe as a metaphor does suggest that these objects have a certain solidity. And I don't want to make them seem too solid, because as you know, as people noted in some of their comments, in the book, I talk about the mutability of secrecy. So, and the multiplicity, the multiplication of secrecy. And I can see that very clearly in you know, discussed at much greater length than I've managed, both in Marika's work and in Brian's work. You know, this point that as researchers sort of entering into sensitive areas, we aren't sort of entirely external to the secret, you know, that we become secret keepers. We're obliged to sort of think about what we disclose and what we keep. So, you know, there's a multiplication of secrecy involved in the process of researching sensitive and securitized spaces, phenomenon. So that suggests, you know, these are not objects in some sort of hard and fast kind of way. The last point that Marika raised was about the literary style of the report. And I think the literary style of the 9/11 Commission report very much fits the sort of what I was calling a device of disclosure, you know, dis/closure, because it's both written in a style that's meant to draw a public in, you know, to sort of get people who are interested in thrillers, give them something, you know, that's narrative and not dry. But it's also at the same time a device of closure, and it was politicized. The families of 9/11 said, we want something that's redacted. We want the report to come out with the redaction, so you can see how much is being sort of kept back. Whereas this sort of literary approach made it smooth, made it look as though this is the whole picture, you know, there's nothing conspiratorial going on here. I really enjoyed and benefited from Lindsay's remarks about ontology and hierarchy, and I can't do justice to them. I mean, one little vignette, another secrecy vignette, was that when I, in the early stages of this work, when I was working with Chantel, who's online with us, you know, we spent a couple of days with the artist Paul Shambroom, who'd done these sort of wonderful photographs of the nuclear infrastructure. And, we asked him, well, how did you get interested in it? Why did you do this? And he says, well, my earlier work was, I was trying to do photographs of corporate boardrooms. And he says, I could have absolutely no access. He produced a series of just photographs of some furniture in sort of big pharmaceutical companies, but he wasn't able to photograph, committee meetings or anything of these corporations. They were too secretive. Whereas, sort of bizarrely and paradoxically, you might think, he's able eventually to get a certain kind of limited access to the nuclear infrastructure. First by sort of getting the Navy, and it took him years. He said it took him 10 years to do this, and that 9/10 of his time was spent trying to get access, writing letters, speaking to Congress people, and then 1/10 was actually taking photographs. So it was a sort of experiment or a probe in his case, and he ends up producing these images of nuclear secrecy precisely because the corporate door is closed in his face. And so I think that tells you something about hierarchy and secrecy and representation and the sort of unevenness of this landscape that we're dealing with. So I've gone on for 10 minutes now, so I'm going to just try to pull things to a conclusion. I'm just looking at Brian had made a remark about that, which I agree with, that we shouldn't assume that the sort of everyday public assumes that it's publicity versus secrecy, that we're all we're canny. We deal with PR people, we deal with spin merchants, we deal with advertising. We kind of know in a sort of intuitive, everyday way how to navigate certain situations where it's not either or, but maybe both or neither. Very lastly, Oliver offered a whole set of comments about interference and sort of materiality of secrecy. And I mean, what I would pick up on is his very last point about Orford Ness and its sort of atmosphere of secrecy. And he proposes a distinction which might be useful between secrecy and secretiveness. Because what's happening at Orford Ness in those documents that are sort of saying, well, these planning documents that say, well, how do we maintain the awe and the mystery and the weirdness of this place, once we open it to the public, if we have to sort of locate management offices somewhere or this or that. So there's clearly a sense that I mean, Brian said, well, aren't I kind of reading too much secrecy into Orford Ness? But I think it's true that I'm doing quite consciously doing a secrecy reading of it, but I'm trying not to sort of impute secrecy in places where it's kind of not happening. So it clearly is the case that the planners themselves are sort of landscaping the site in a way that amplifies, intensifies experiences of awe, mystery, uncanniness, unease, all sorts of things like that. So there is a sort of production of secrecy in that sense, or as Oliver would call it, secretiveness. And that's different from keeping secrets. So the National Trust is not, in that sense, keeping secrets, but it is sort of, I would say, playing with a kind of secrecy capital. It's cultivating a mood of secrecy, and I think that's another feature of our public culture that someone like Jodie Dean has written about a lot. That secrecy animates a public. It's secrecy that draws us in. It's our fascination with what we don't know, going back to Lindsay's point about the door as well. Anyway, so that's 13 minutes. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. So before we turn to the audience questions, I just wanted to give the other panelists an opportunity, maybe just for easiness, to respond in the order that they presented, just to some of the comments that William made, or perhaps some of the comments that the other panelists made. So if there's something that you wanted, that sprung to mind, we have a few minutes for you to share that now. If you do, no pressure, if not. And then we can turn to the audience questions. So Marika, you're shaking your head in a negative.
Yeah, no, I just think it would be nice to bring the audience in. So I have nothing to react to right now, but maybe later.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Lindsay next. Did you have anything you wanted to just add or respond to there?
Hi, Daniel again. I agree with Marike that it would be fabulous to bring in the audience. And there's been some really interesting comments too in the side about, I'm interested in this, about the border policy. And just maybe one quick point on what William's great point about corporate secrecy. That's what I also find fascinating, because we know, for example, how inaccessible these spaces are, and yet it's somehow considered acceptable that the veil of sort of, the corporate veil that surrounds sort of actual judicial decisions surrounding whether to pierce different aspects of corporate confidentiality are so protected. So somehow the obviousness of that protection makes that corporate secrecy more palatable in a way that nuclear secrets are somehow seen as more conspiratorial in a way. So it is a fascinating, I think, vignette about the corporate secrecy that William brought up.
Brian, did you want to add anything?
No, let's open it up.
Okay, and Oliver?
Just to say, following up there, and what Lindsay's saying, some of that William talks about in the introduction, which I hadn't thought of before, and I thought was very true, speaks to this question of corporate secrecy, that corporate actors themselves may not always think of what they do in terms of secrecy. Like what Lindsay just said, they might think, well, this is part of protecting our legally mandated confidentiality. And there would be a question of playing with the covert imaginary there. They wouldn't want it to be implied that they were being secretive and therefore illegitimate in some way. That raises a good question for scholars. So if they say it's not secret, what's the scholarly rationale and justification for saying, yes, you are? We have to decide something about secrecy in that case.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm going to take a liberty, and Anna Wall and Georgina Lewis have both posed questions that have some commonalities. I may take an editorial liberty on that one. And they're both asking in one way or another about trust. So Anna points out the trust hasn't been mentioned in relation to secrecy so far. And whether who is speaking the words, who is doing the talking, and who the audience are, maybe what kind of role do you think that might play? So Georgina is asking, and building on Lindsay's points, whether a secret is accepted, or whether what we don't know, or whether, what the sort of the known unknowns are more acceptable or palatable. I mean, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, William, and then, again, the rest of the panel as well. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm certainly keen to hear the panel answer questions as well. So this question of trust and secrecy, and the set of questions that Lindsay raised about that maybe publics are more accepting of things when there's a sort of that when they have a partial visibility, even if the visibility of the thing in question is quite awful. This is a very interesting question. I think that we sometimes, as security scholars, or those of us who are security scholars, sometimes kind of overestimate a kind of general public unease about secrecy. I think that one of the lessons of the Snowden revelations is how how much of public opinion sort of thinks he's especially in the United States, how much it thinks he's a traitor, a heretic, a bad guy, despite the kind of content of what he's made public, that your state is spying on you. So I think we always have to kind of keep in mind that, like, it would be wrong to we want to get beyond a theorization or understanding of secrecy from within an entirely liberal framework, right? This is one of the really important things of the really rich historical studies that we have of secrecy, of the kind that sort of that we have from Eva Horn, or there's the opening chapter of Claire Birchall's book on radical secrecy, a kind of genealogy of secrecy, if you will, which I was, I didn't manage anything like that in the book. But the sort of sense that we have to, that it's not as though raison d'etat as a governmentality, or whatever we want to call it, has gone away. It's not as though, the world of liberalism pushes it to one side. We still live very much within the sort of matrix of raison d'etat. So whatever secrecy kind of came to mean and crystallized within raison d'etat is still a part of our reality. You know, all the kinds of lies and deceptions that are considered acceptable because they're about defending the state, securing the state in a violent, unstable, uncertain world. So I think that this question of trust then, yes, trust is sort of important and relevant, especially when we are talking about secrecy in liberal contexts, but in as much as secrecy, you know, has this older, it has a much longer history where it's attached to protection, to monarchy, to hierarchy, to religion and mystery, then those aren't really, you know, trust isn't really the right concept to think about how we as subjects relate to those kinds of powers, those kinds of authorities. You know, we're not being asked to trust in, well, we are sort of asked to trust in God, I suppose, but it's more about faith or submission and domination, as Lindsay was saying. So those are my half-baked thoughts about trust.
A really interesting point about what's the difference between faith and trust in this context as well. And would anybody else like to respond from the panel?
Maybe just a quick point in addition to that. I think where I see the issue of trust as being quite interesting here in particular is when it comes to sort of an ideological faith in the superiority of a modern liberal Western state, where one thing we're asked to trust in is this notion of what really differentiates our societies from others is the openness of political processes. So in such a scenario, secrecy takes on a particularly taboo sort of salience when it comes to its existence. And therefore people collectively seem to militate together in placing a sort of sense of virtue in what is seemingly open. But that's often misplaced faith because what appears open, like corporate stats or corporate procedures, actually can veil a deeper secrecy. So trust is interesting when it comes to this sort of political salience that openness has, I think, in our societies, but often it's misplaced trust because we are far less open, clearly, than we purport to be in, you know, the texts that we teach to children on, say, civics or ethics or other aspects that make us supposedly superior.
Perhaps briefly to connect to that also the notions of corporate secrecy. So I think that's very interesting what was said. And when you talk about corporate secrecy, you would normally talk about intellectual property protection or intellectual property rights or confidentiality. So, and I think it was just said also by Oliver, the word secrecy is less often used. And you know, for me personally, I became interested in secrecy and theorizing secrecy, and also in relation to method, was because when I went to a big grant funder to propose doing our research on counterterrorism financing, almost all of my questions at the interview panel were about access and not accessing the state intelligence unit, but accessing the banks, which we propose to do in this project is to sort of observe how banks in practice counterterrorism financing, like what do they do when they say that they are countering the financing of terrorism. And almost all the questions I had were about how were we going to access the banks? Would the banks cooperate with us? Why would they do that? So the panel seemed really anxious about our ability to do that. And that ties into the notion of corporate secrecy, where you also see that privacy, for example, then becomes an argument for not cooperating with researchers or letting researchers giving access to researchers. Actually, we did find the banks very cooperative with our research, but that was also in a way a strategy of managed disclosure. So that was also because they were interested in, having parts of their practices more known to the outside world. So there was an interesting choreography, you could say, about what they wanted to show and what we wanted to know about. I also really like Claire Birchel's question here about whether the word secret always already involves a truth claim. I think that's a super interesting question. And also, the way that Derrida talks about the secrecy effect, if something is secret, there must be a kind of truth to it, or just the very secrecy of it has a kind of effect, whether that's imaginary or not. I think in William's book, the President Daily briefings are such an interesting example because they become the focal point also for the families who lost family members at 9/11 attacks. They become such an important focal point and become inscribed with such meaning. But then when they are released, they seem to be containing, or they're not fully released, but they're read and rendered, and they seem to be containing everything and nothing. And actually in our research, we've seen plenty of examples where classified materials in another space are actually public materials. So they become classified and you think, oh, here must be, some actual, very exciting truth of what this security program is doing, but then actually, we know that at least partly what's happening in classified materials, they're recycled materials that were previously public. They become part of a classified dossier, and so they have the status of being classified, but they don't necessarily contain. They might sometimes, but they don't necessarily, by definition, contain. That kernel of truth that we often like to think we're getting at when revealing or uncovering a secret. Sorry, just some loose thoughts in reply to or in relation to some of the points that have come.
I would have a couple of thoughts following on from the questions that have been raised and people's responses. One about this question of the role of trust, and off of what William was saying, and a slight reticence about what kind of emphasis we place upon trust. I wonder whether a question like that speaks to this issue of the role of social relations, interpersonal relations in the production of secrecy. Something that, again, that came up in the book was the issue of when these Soviet telegrams were decrypted, there was immediately a question of, or even when they were held, there was immediately a question of, well, who amongst people in the United States, Britain and elsewhere who had these, who should we share them with? Who should we tell about this even before we've done anything with them? I think that point gets at the fact that secrecy is, if we just take secrecy for the moment, is more than what you're doing with knowledge. It's about the creation of a social network, and to an extent, a closed social network. These people I will talk to and no further, or it changes over time and so on. And yeah, that is a trust can then become something, we'll talk about the psychology of that, but certainly sociologically, it's then about different kinds of relatively distinct social networks. The other thought is, again, about this issue of publics and acceptance of secrecy or not. I just I wonder whether we shouldn't be too quick to, and this has been said before, to assume acceptance or even acquiescence in contemporary liberal democracies, because it requires a certain kind of empirics that has to be done to discern that acceptance or acquiescence. I mean, someone like Gaju Bhattacharya has talked about the fact that war on terror practices over the last 20 years, to a large extent, didn't require trust or acceptance or acquiescence on the part of liberal democratic populations. That was relatively unimportant, unless to the extent that that turns into concrete opposition and protest and the stymieing of those material efforts to keep secrets and to carry out secret practices. The question there is rather one of an association in the covert imaginary that William describes, popular common sense about what secrecy is about. the association between secrecy and empowerment, and secrecy and disempowerment, that when someone expresses secrecy, they're saying to you, I know something you don't know. And the reaction from the person who doesn't hold it is, oh yeah, I can see that. Therefore, there's a part of the world that I know nothing about, and that they internalize this disempowerment as a result. A lot of what we might call acquiescence is really people saying, well, I'm opposed to this and I want to resist it, but I don't know how. And again, that speaks to how publics are created by secrecy, I think, there.
Lovely, thank you. Brian, I think you had a point.
Yeah, I wanted to come up onto the point that Claire raised in the discussion that came about whether secret always involves a truth claim. And I guess here I would say it doesn't seem like it, because I can think of one area, idle gossip, where there's all sorts of maybe secrets that are shared in a very maybe it's a playful way, maybe there's other ways of characterizing it, right? Where people involved in those conversations, maybe, right? At times, certainly, at least, maybe are engaging in that kind of activity, not because they're sharing truths, because maybe in terms of what Oliver said, they're sharing a sense of belonging, or a sense of identity, a sense of network. I mean, lots of things are coming into play with something like gossip. Truth, maybe. I mean, I think a lot of it just depends. Just like I think it depends on whether or not secrecy is necessarily associated with some kind of epistemological kind of status or heightened status or something. I mean, yeah, we can think of a lot of things where, you kind of like, I got it here, right? And I got a secret, and, you're really curious as to what's in this box or whatever. But I mean, there are all sorts of areas where the positioning of secrecy would be detrimental to the status of knowledge claims. Okay, so I mean, in science, right? In general, the idea of having secret knowledge is, at least in terms of the rhetoric of science, is not typically identified as a kind of good thing, right? It doesn't necessarily heighten the status of what you have if you say, I've got it locked away somewhere, right? But I mean, all these things are, it seems to me that there's just so much of this, it's just down to the particulars of the situation, the cultural context in which it's taking place. I mean, I guess we can find examples pointing in all sorts of directions. So for me, maybe the question is, when does this happen, that secrets have involve a kind of claim to some sort of truth? And maybe we can map those out. Maybe there's interesting kind of patternings that happen with that. But I would want to stay away from absolute claims. Yeah.
If I could, pick up on that, and I absolutely agree about context, and sort of connecting that to going back to Claire Birchall's remark about conspiracy theories. I read a very nice paper recently. I can't remember who it was by. It's by a team who've done some very kind of a lot of social network and data mapping of sort of 5G of conspiracies around COVID and the vaccines and the burning of cell phone towers. And I think and it sort of showed, well, here's all these people who've kind of been online or connected to these networks sharing this story or this conspiracy theory about what's causing illness. But the analysis showed that a lot of the people involved in this sharing it didn't kind of believe in it. They didn't think it was some sort of hidden truth that was being trafficked. It was pleasure, right? It was this goes back to Zimmel's point about recognizing the charms of secrecy is the term he uses, and this is a part of the aesthetics of secrecy. It's very much a part of the way secrecy features in so many movies. There's a lot of pleasures to it, and so it's not always. It'd be wrong to always assume it's about a hidden knowledge or a hidden truth or a quest for truth, that it has a strong epistemological basis. I mean, obviously it does in all sorts of really important situations, but then there are all sorts of other worlds where it's pleasure. And hence, my remark about games of secrecy would speak to that because, you know, going back to, I can't remember whose comment it was, but I think it was Brian sort of saying that some people found that disturbing, the notion of game, because it sounds like it's trivializing. You know, we can have war games, we can have Russian roulette, that's a game, you know, where you get your head blown off. To call something a game isn't necessarily to trivialize it. Games can be matters of life and death as well. But games sort of recognizes that there's many different ways that a game can be played, or that something can become a game. So I think conspiracy theories are partly games of secrecy, perhaps, particular game.
If I can just direct the question a little bit. So Anna Waller's asked another really good question about whether your book goes into what general situations, structures and conditions best enable secrets to be kept, and whether there's little consistency, and whether I could just link that back to the point that Claire Birchall was raising about whether conspiracy theories actually make a difference to the covert imaginary either. And again, this might be something that the other panelists would like to speak to as well, but is there a consistency, and have you noticed, if there is any, or if maybe there isn't, whether conspiracy theories have made a difference? Have they affected that imaginary in some way?
I certainly, I mean, in the book, I can't offer any kind of claims or answers about what situation, structures, or conditions best enable secrets to be kept. But this question of conspiracy theory, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that conspiracy theory is now a huge part of the covert imaginary. You know, if one's talking about what are the modes by which we experience, visualize, imagine secrets and secret keeping, then conspiracy theory is really sort of big at the moment. And, you know, not just as a sort of popular or cultural phenomenon. You know, we have now large sort of governmental investments and research investments into, you know, you might say that the conspiracy theory is becoming governmentalized. There are all sorts of inquiries worrying about what does conspiracy theory do to the trust of publics in scientific authority or in political authority or in the military and so on. So, you know, we've got all these attempts to measure conspiracy networks, to map them, to quantify them, to test them. So conspiracy theory is becoming an object, I would say. It's not, you know, it's kind of different from when Hofstadter writes about the paranoid style, right? It's now becoming a sort of techno-scientific object within governmental problematizations. But it's also very much a part of the covert imaginary. Yeah, that's what I had to say about that.
Would anyone else like to add to the question of whether conspiracy theories affect how we approach secrecy, or how maybe the sort of hegemonic approach to secrecy, is it changing the content, maybe not the content, but the sort of processes that states use to talk about these things, either officially or unofficially?
Yeah, I would want to jump in on that. About its relationship to a covert imaginary, its conspiracy theory's relationship to how generally secrecy is thought about. It reinforces a strong normative element to discussions of secrecy. I don't know that there would be anybody, for instance, on the panel or in the audience who would want to out themselves now as a conspiracy theorist. It carries a strong pull of certain kinds of discussions of secrecy are, so not only are certain kinds of secrecy legitimate and others illegitimate, but certain kinds of critical assessments of them are legitimate and others illegitimate. I know there are others who are more versed in this literature than me, but it's taken a while even for scholarship on conspiracy theories to grapple with the ontology of it, of using this as a concept in order to study when it already carries this kind of normative baggage, what we decide counts as conspiracy theory or not. So I would have thought, if anything, and there was the talk there, William, of the governmentalizing of conspiracy theories. incorporating them into a certain way of trying to govern peoples or to have them govern themselves. I think they might have an unfortunate parasitic relationship to one another, that being moralizing about conspiracy theories in turn reinforces a very limited understanding of what secrecy is. So even those who want to study conspiracy theories, who mainly talk about it in terms of what kind of not spoken negative social effects does it have, limit our idea of what secrecy does. Just a very practical thing, I know, for instance, in William's book, he talks about the efforts of what we would normally call conspiracy theorists in producing documents that are then very helpful for those of us who don't study conspiracy theories but want to study other aspects of how secrecy operates. So anyway, I just wonder if there's in terms of studying such a phenomenon, those things reinforce how we limit our own imaginations.
I would add to that, and there's another way in which conspiracy theory is sort of not like just this fringe thing outside of the world that most of us are interested in, but actual something that has its own effects. And I mean, it's a point that Marika's raised in her work on, I think, the 7/11 inquiry, and you see it very much in the 9/11 inquiry, where the very kind of convening of the inquiry, from the beginning, there's this sort of debate amongst the people putting it together that, well, you know, we don't want another Kennedy assassination, which gives rise to, you know, we don't want another Warren Commission, which seems to suggest that there's been a cover up and just causes conspiracy theory to proliferate. We're going to have a really thorough inquiry. You know, it's this dream, at least, of if we can have a very thorough inquiry, we'll kind of damp down all of that speculation and rumor. So conspiracy theory there, again, as an object or as a phenomenon, enters into the sort of calculations and the politics and the deliberations of people who can consider themselves not conspiracy theorists, but people who are tasked with producing some sort of account or narrative or version of what actually happened, what went wrong, what we should do. So conspiracy theory is inside that already, I would say.
Maybe I'll jump in there too. I think it's such an important and interesting question. And I think something that really needs to happen potentially around the language of conspiracy is something of a reclaiming of the anti-hierarchical aspects of it that are useful for illuminating which groups have the power to instantiate and sort of induce perceptions of what counts as truth or not. And so when I say a reclaiming of the word of conspiracy, I sort of mean a reclaiming in the same sense that the word ignorance had to be reappropriated and reestablished as not necessarily simply a pejorative phenomenon or noun or adjective to describe someone as ignorant, because that reclaiming is a part of destabilizing or challenging dominant power sources when it comes to establishing truth. And I do think, just like William's book got me really thinking about the relationship between secrecy and hierarchy, I think there is something importantly, fundamentally anti-hierarchical about secrecy, and that we can all keep secrets. The capacity to maintain secrets is a non-monopolizable capacity, and that's what makes it partly emancipative. But when you know that marginalized groups can themselves retain secrets or perpetuate them potentially for political gain, that is when the power to then deride those secrets as conspiratorial comes to the forefront. And therefore, again, that capacity to dismiss something as conspiratorial can be seen as a very strong tool to lead to power. So great question on conspiracy. And I really liked Oliver and William's points about it too. But it's really got me thinking about ways that I think it's interesting that only recently conspiracy has come to the forefront too. Why not immediately after 9/11? I don't know.
And what you say, Lindsay, is very resonates strongly with William's chapter on deportation, where William is saying we have this very clear image of the routes into Europe, for instance, but no real clear visual imaginary of all of the routes going in the other direction. So a very skewed idea about where power and where insecurities lie.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. I think at this point we should draw it to a close. And let me just, on behalf of SPIN, just say thank you very much indeed to William for sharing the book with us this evening, and also to the panelists for agreeing to come and offer such insightful and frankly fascinating insights and reflections. That kind of sort of cross-disciplinary and broad selection of perspectives was absolutely invaluable. And may I just end finally with a bit of shameless network promotion, where if you haven't already heard of the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Research Network, you can find out more about us at secrecyresearch.com. And if you'd like to find out more about the events we're running, or even to maybe become part of the sort of research and progress meetings that we hold every couple of months, to get involved as a researcher, you are very welcome. We are open to all. So thank you very much, and just end by offering a virtual clap to everyone on the panel, and thank you very much. I hope we get to meet again in some format. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all so much.